My name is Mildred Whitmore. I'm 64, and on that late Tuesday morning, all I wanted to do was walk down the hall, sign whatever was fair, and return home with my head on straight. 3 months of widowhood don't fit on a calendar. They reside in the smell of Harold's coat, which still sleeps on the back of the chair. I had brewed a stronger than usual coffee and left the mug on the saucer as if leaving a message for myself. Stay alert. The sharing meeting was scheduled for 2, but I arrived too early, as I always did when the subject could become a trap. I wore my charcoal wool suit, the one that doesn't attract attention, and a violet-shaped brooch Harold gave me for our 25th anniversary. In the hall mirror, I tied my hair in a low bun and saw a woman who still knew her own story, even if they tried to rewrite it. Autumn had that dry paper wind, which turns corners and carries leaves and secrets. I took a deep breath, key in my pocket, and headed to the parking lot of the building, where Morrison and Associates rented the 12th floor. I promised myself, today I enter as a widow and leave as the owner of my voice. I always start difficult days by choosing an anchor. In this case, it was Harold's watch, with a brown strap, scratched around the edges, stubborn like him. When I locked the key in the car, I heard his memory laugh at my early delay. "Millie, you're early even when you're in doubt." Parking space 17 had an oil slick the shape of a continent, and I thought old maps were less likely to lie than some people. The light rain made the ground shine, as if someone had varnished the concrete. Behind me, the sliding gate groaned, a sound of metal with a sore throat. I tightened the grip on my purse, checked the folder with documents and the death certificate, and walked slowly so as not to slip. My hands were cold, but my head was hot with conjecture. I reviewed numbers, dates, clauses, the will I knew, Harold's serenity as he signed it, his care with every comma. In this balance between what I remember and what might make me forget, that a voice burst like a pot lid. "Miss Mildred, don't start the car." I turned and saw Eddie Kowalski, a face I recognized from a courthouse corridor, a former paralegal with the eyes of a dog who once knew his way around, a beard with big pens stuck in it like bricklayers' pencils. He wore a denim jacket with a lightning bolt patch and a beanie whose original color had given up. His open-toed sneakers revealed striped socks, and the laces were tied like a sailor's knot who'd forgotten the sea. He smelled of gas station coffee and mint, and he shivered, not just from the cold. His fingers held a manila envelope puffed up like bread in the oven. "Seriously, ma'am, your daughter-in-law and Morrison are making moves on you." The gate groaned again, as if confirming it, and my heart, that exemplary old employee, beat twice in a row. He spoke quickly, but each word had the dust of a hallway and the clarity of someone who'd read what no one wanted me to. Forged medical reports, fabricated statements, all to declare you incompetent and lock you into a trust. He said trust like someone biting a fruit pit without sweetness. He explained that Maisie had been pushing the beware of the confused mother-in-law story, and that the office was waving their pens like a fishing rod for money. $300,000 in debt for the couple, Miss Mildred. The plan is to clean it up with Harold's assets and give him a $40,000 annual allowance. The word allowance hit my face like cold water from a hose. Me, an adult, reduced to the budget line. "I have the right things," he said, touching the envelope. "But upstairs they'll try to speed up your signature." I looked at the elevator like someone looking at a wind tunnel, and at Eddie like someone looking for a dry match on a stormy day. "Why would I believe you?" I asked, my voice firm as a new soul. He lowered his gaze, then raised it, and in his eyes was a roomful of shelves, shame, anger, a desire to make amends, because I've pushed paper I shouldn't have, and these days I only sleep when I manage to pull one back. The confession came without a string, only truth. I remembered seeing him years ago, precise as a ruler, opening folders for a lawyer who spoke like an airport announcer. The world changes people's uniforms, but it doesn't change their handwriting. I nodded, once, like someone stamping a name. "I'll go up anyway," I said. "This is what you say
Eddie,
it is. If meet me on the 12th. He took a breath like someone swallowing a sledgehammer and nodded. The elevator had a tinted mirror and a sign stuck askew. "Please remain silent." I saw my own face slightly blurred and, behind it, the silhouette of my doubts grimacing. On the 10th, a young woman entered with a box of donuts and a smile like someone who'd never needed a lawyer. On the 11th, a man in a burgundy tie who smelled of rain stored in a closet. The doors opened on the 12th with a blast of air colder than the air conditioning could explain. The receptionist from Morrison & Associates had almond-shaped nails and a smile that stopped at the turnstile. "Mrs. Whitmore, the Blueberry Room, please. They already have the recording on." Blueberry. I smiled inwardly, a childish name for a room that chews up grown-ups. I walked down the thickly carpeted corridor like an ancient secret, feeling the violet brooch weigh heavy on my chest like a seal. The Blueberry Room had a table too long for an honest meeting. 3 water glasses were strategically sweaty, as if they had nerves of their own. Maisie was impeccable. A cream blazer, a bracelet that jingled softly, a catalog smile. Michael didn't meet my eyes. He straightened his sleeve as if arranging an alibi. On the side of the office, Mr. Dalton and Mrs. Pierce, he with a voice that came from a well, she with eyes that added interest. A digital recorder glowed discreetly in the center, red light, dotting the air. "We're recording for your safety." I sat and leaned the briefcase against my side, like someone leaning an umbrella knowing the rain is inside. "Thanks for coming, Mildred. We have some routine paperwork, nothing major," Dalton said, pushing a pad of papers with anxious clips. I felt the floor give a wink of sarcasm. The first few pages seemed innocent, lists of assets, descriptions I recognized like someone recognizing their own handwriting. Then the terms changed tone, like music slipping into a suspenseful soundtrack. The word guardianship appeared like a cockroach in the kitchen, small, fleeting, unwanted. There it was, the trust, conditions, guardianship, limitations, a maze where my voice entered loudly and came out whispered. "It's a protection mechanism, Mildred," Pierce said, adjusting her necklace. "With an annual provision of $40,000 sufficient for your comfort." Comfort, to her, seemed to fit in an armchair that doesn't recline. "By signing we speed up the process and avoid legal stress," Dalton added, offering a pen with the firm's logo. I touched the pen to the paper just to measure the weight of the lie. "Before I sign, I want to understand the reports that justify this guardianship," I said. And the red light on the recorder flickered like a restless firefly. Dalton smirked, as if dealing with a stubborn child, and pulled out a sky-blue folder with flaps. Nothing alarming, just signs of confusion common in your aid. Group, see? Minor lapses. Minor lapses. The mug in the freezer, the key in the sugar bowl, the bill paid twice, and each slip turned into a stepping stone to push me downhill. Maisie folded her hands on the table, fingers perfectly aligned as if praying to a saint of money. Michael cleared his throat and glanced out the window, where the buildings drew graphs of rise and fall. I felt Harold's watch on my wrist, marking not the time, but the boundaries. "I want to see the original signed by my Dr. and Harold," I said, my voice still steady. Pierce responded with a sure, which meant never. The air in the room took on the density of cold soup, and each breath became a spoon that caught nothing. "We made certified copies, it's all there," Dalton said, touching papers that shone too new to have lived in a drawer. I noticed a misaligned date, a stamp with more generous ink than the office standard, a signature that looked like it had been flexed, too hard in the wrong place. "You're recording? Great," I said, and turned the page with the tip of my ring finger, the one with the 43-year-old ring. "Because I also brought questions." Maisie smiled, but her eyes held the weariness of someone trying to convince the mirror. The pen on my finger swung like a hypnotist's pendulum, and I refused to sleep. From the hallway came a sound of hurried footsteps, metal hitting door frame. The carpet swallowed the sound, but the room felt it. The door opened with a click the building doesn't usually allow. Eddie entered first, not asking permission from the invisible spotlight that covers moments like these. His coat had fresh drops, and the manila envelope was now an open sheaf of documents with edges that counted miles. Behind him, the floor security guard raised his hand, more tired than prohibitive. "Sorry for the interruption. It's just that the rush here is of a different kind," Eddie said, placing the package on the table like someone landing a bird that has flown too far. Dalton half rose, his voice stumbling over vowels. Pierce searched for some non-existent button to turn off reality. Maisie let out a "what?" that sounded like she'd fallen from a high heel. And my heart, an exemplary employee, beat for the third time. Original version of the will, intact, signed by Harold and notarized by the Maple Street notary, Eddie announced, pulling the first thread of a tightly sewn piece of fabric. Legitimate medical reports, signed by Dr. Levin, with no indication incapacity, and receipts linking the office to the hiring of consultants who fabricate evidence. With each piece placed on the table, the red light of the recorder took on a new irony, as if writing captions. From the doorway, a firm voice cut through the air. "No one touches anything." It was Detective Sarah Chen, badge on her lapel, the look of someone piecing together a puzzle starting with the middle pieces. The security guard took a step back. The room, too, and I, for the first time that day, felt the floor stop blinking. The theater, at last, saw the audience. "I'm waiting for your okay to continue with the next 12 paragraphs." Sarah Chen entered with a commanding hand. Her beige coat had subtle rain stains, and her eyes were as clear as a scalpel. "Ms. Whitmore, you may remain seated. This area is now considered a preliminary investigation scene." Dalton tried to stand again, but the detective raised her hand and her authority made his tie shrink. Pierce swallowed and Maisie hard. Tightened her wristband so tightly it nearly turned into a handrail. Michael, my son, seemed to have suddenly shrunk 2 suit sizes. I could feel the brooch on my chest heat up, as if Harold had breathed "it'll work out" through the metal. Eddie arranged the papers like someone sorting playing cards before showing the trick. The red light on the recorder continued to flash, but now it was a witness against the caller. And I, despite trembling inside, realized the tables were turning. Sarah collected the documents one by one, cataloging them as if they were fossils in a dig. Original medical report, authentic stamp. Here we see a discrepancy in the date. She spoke slowly, but each word fell like a judge's gavel. Dalton tried to intervene. "Detective, this isn't the appropriate forum. That's not for you to decide," he replied firmly. Maisie murmured something about misunderstanding and good faith, but her voice no longer convinced even her own vocal cords. Michael ran, his hand over his face, pulling at the skin as if trying to wake from a nightmare. And I watched, remembering every micro gesture, knowing I would go over it all 1,000 times later, alone at home. Eddie, in a corner, seemed relieved to finally be on the right side of a table. It was like seeing a former musician playing the right note again after years of being out of tune. "We'll need to hear from everyone separately," Sarah said, opening the diary. Dalton and Pierce exchanged glances, wondering which closet hides a secret exit. Maisie couldn't resist. This is a circus. She's always been confused, you know." The word confused pierced me like a needle. I remembered when I accidentally added salt to Harold's coffee, and he just laughed, saying it was sweet from so much love. They turned my distractions into a diagnosis, my longing into incompetence. Sarah looked directly at Maisie. "The evidence suggests otherwise. I recommend you think carefully before you speak." The silence in the room was no longer tense, but falling. It felt like a roof collapsing and the dust hasn't yet settled. And for the first time, I breathed without the taste of iron in my mouth. Michael finally opened his mouth. "Mom, he said, but the sentence died in his throat. I saw in him not just the man in his early 40s, but the boy who hid school notes in Harold's pockets. His hair, now prematurely gray, was as disheveled as his certainties. Maisie showed me reports, said it was for your own good. I didn't know how to question it. The confession came shakily, but genuinely. I felt anger and compassion warring inside me, like kittens trapped in the same box. Sarah recorded everything, her pen gliding like a blade over paper. Eddie avoided looking at me, perhaps out of shame at how much this hurt me. The Blueberry Room had never been as acidic as it was in that moment. "Whitmore, are you willing to press charges?" Sarah asked. My whole body wanted to scream yes, but my mouth took a second to obey. "I am," I replied, and the word came out like a scraped gemstone, rough but shiny. Maisie let out a sob that she tried to turn into a cough. Dalton mumbled something about unnecessary consequences, but no one gave him a chance. Pierce was no longer speaking. His eyes calculated the cost of his own ruin. Michael shrank back in his chair, as if he had finally grasped the scale of the plot. Eddie pulled his hat down, perhaps to hide a tear that didn't quite fit the wall. I felt Harold in every corner of the room, not as a ghost, but as a silent witness. And I realized I was protecting not only my assets, but also the respect he had always given me. When the meeting officially adjourned, I left the room with short steps, but each one carried the weight of a final paragraph. In the hallway, the carpet felt softer, as if returning stolen dignity. The receptionist didn't even dare smile. She looked away, perhaps already knowing the office gossip would take on a different tone. The elevator took a while to arrive, and in that time, my heart sank a few floors. Michael followed me, hands in his pockets, his gaze lost between regret and fear. "I didn't want it to be like this, Mom," he said, but I didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the only legacy left to offer. Eddie said a quick goodbye, promising to bring more details to the police. Sarah remained upstairs, steadfast as a guardian of the truth. When the elevator door finally opened, it felt like a portal to a life I hadn't asked for, but needed to traverse. In the parking lot, the world seemed brighter, even with low clouds. The sound of cars on the avenue sounded like distant applause. I unlocked the car, but didn't get in right away. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel, feeling the cool leather, and let the tears fall. I cried not only from fear, but from realizing how close I'd come to losing everything without even understanding the move. I cried for Harold, for having his memory as if it were an auction item. And I cried for Michael, my boy lost in the labyrinth of his own weakness. But amidst my tears, I also smiled. I had escaped a trap designed to turn me into a shadow, and shadows leave no legacy. I was alive, whole, and in control of myself. That night at home, I sat in Harold's armchair and left his clock on the table. The ticking seemed to speak to me, reminding me that time was not an enemy, but a witness. I made chamomile tea with honey, as I did when he came home tired. The taste brought back fond memories, but also the courage he always instilled in me. I gathered the papers Sarah had returned to me: will, reports, receipts. I ran my fingers over each line, like someone running their hand over the fur of a surviving animal. I glanced at the wall where our wedding photo still hung, Harold in a blue suit and a shy smile. "We did it, love," I whispered, and for a moment the house responded with a soft silence, a silence that accused me but embraced me. The following days were filled with phone calls, statements, and trips to the police station. Each time I repeated my story, I felt like I was washing a foggy window. The truth shone brighter, but it also revealed the dirt hidden for years. Michael stayed away, sending short messages as if rehearsing apologies. Maisie, I learned, was crying in front of the lawyers, trying to negotiate a collective misunderstanding. Dalton and Pierce, on the other hand, were already appearing in the local newspapers, accused of conspiracy and document forgery. The name Morrison and Associates, once synonymous with prestige, was now a joke in cafes and bank lines. Eddie found me once more, thanking me for believing in him. He said that now, with the help of the police, he had a chance to get back on his feet. I squeezed his hand tightly, recognizing in the grip the possibility of redemption. But the hardest part was yet to come, the reckoning with my son. He arrived on a rainy afternoon, unannounced, with an expression that blended regret and lost boy. "Can I come in?" he asked, as if the house that had been his no longer belonged to him. I let him because a mother always leaves a crack open. We sat at the kitchen table, and he kept twisting his wedding ring on his finger, a clear sign of someone who no longer knows where it belongs. "I was weak, Mom. Maisie convinced me you were slipping, and I didn't want to see it was manipulation." The words came out heavy, each one a brick falling onto the tile. I looked at him, not as a victim, but as an accomplice in rehabilitation. The wound was open, but the blood was still flowing, and while it flows, there's a chance of life. I took a deep breath and said, "Michael, I'd even get the money back. What I almost lost was my own voice." He lowered his head, discreet tears staining the table. I continued, "Your father always trusted me. You, who are my own flesh and blood, believed more in the stumbles than in the entire journey." The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. Michael tried to defend himself but gave up mid-sentence. "I want to make amends, Mom. I'm going to separate from Maisie, and I'm going to face my debts alone." I didn't applaud, I didn't console, I just listened, as if each word were evidence in a private court. Pain doesn't heal in an afternoon, but begins when the truth is told. And that was the first afternoon he told the whole truth. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently. The walls, which once held secrets and silences, now echoed truths spoken aloud. I prepared my meals without rushing to justify where I'd spent every penny. I walked again in the neighborhood park and noticed that even the trees looked at me with new respect. The sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed to say, "You still decide your own path." Each step I took without asking permission was a reminder that autonomy is not negotiable. I walked slowly but steadily, and felt the weight of Harold's watch like a medal of endurance. The wooden bench where we used to sit together was now mine alone, and I didn't see it as empty but as a space I'd conquered. I felt pride in myself, something that had been hidden beneath years of compromise, and I vowed never to give up my voice again. One night, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Chen. Her voice was calm but carried the firmness of someone who has walked many corridors of truth and lies. "Mrs. Whitmore, I just wanted to inform you that the charges against Morrison and Associates have been formally accepted by the judge." She explained that the process would be long, but the evidence was strong. On the other end of the line, I heard my own sigh, as if I had been waiting for that sound all my life. "You were brave. Not many people in your position would have withstood the pressure, she said. I closed my eyes and felt as if Harold were silently applauding. Thank you, detective. I didn't do it just for myself. I did it because I know other women may be going through the same thing. She nodded and said goodnight, and I, alone in the room, smiled for the first time without feeling guilty. The news spread quickly through the community. At the market, I noticed curious looks, some filled with solidarity, others with malicious whispers. A neighbor, Mrs. Marlene, approached with teary eyes. Mildred, you're an inspiration. My brother-in-law tried something similar on my mother-in-law. Her words touched me deeply. I realized my story wasn't just mine. It was part of something bigger, a pattern of silent abuse against elderly women. I accepted her embrace and, for the first time, felt I was not just a survivor, but a collective voice. Other women began to reach out to me, each with their own version of a scam disguised as care. It was frightening to realize how fragile we were seen, when in fact we bore the weight of entire families. I decided, right then and there, that I wouldn't let my struggle turn to dust. I needed to transform pain into a tool. The following Sunday, I attended Mass at the neighborhood church. The sermon spoke of trials and justice, and every word seemed chosen for me. When the Mass ended, several women came up to hug me. I heard what happened, Mildred. You set an example of courage, one of them said, her voice breaking. I took her hands and replied, it's not courage alone, it's memory. Harold didn't let me give up on myself. The priest also came to me, placing his hand on my shoulder. Your faith was tested and remained standing. I felt tears well up, but they weren't of pain. They were of relief. It was as if, at that altar, I had restored dignity not only to myself, but to all those who watched me in silence. The church pew, hard as always, felt soft that day, and I left there lighter than when I entered. Michael visited me again after weeks of silence, this time without a ring, without the weary expression of someone who had finally faced his own shadow. I'm starting from scratch, Mom. I sold the car, I'm renegotiating the debts. It's going to be hard, but it's my path. I looked at him with a mixture of pain and hope. It was hard knowing he'd only learned after losing so much, but he was still my son. That's what your father would have expected of you, to shoulder your own burden, I replied. He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I saw sincerity in the gleam in his eyes. I didn't hug him immediately. I let him feel the gravity of the moment. After a few seconds, I extended my hand, and that squeeze was a silent pact of rebuilding. The investigation progressed, and Maisie couldn't resist the pressure. She accepted a plea deal, probation, 500 hours of community service, and partial restitution. When I found out, I didn't feel revenge, just relief. It was as if the play had finally been dismantled, the sets removed, the costumes stored. Decided to divorce Michael, tired of living on a stage where he'd always been a supporting character. He cried when he told me, but I knew it was a cry of liberation. Maisie, in turn, became a newspaper article, an example of how ambition can corrode homes. I didn't wish her harm, only distance. You reap what you sow, and she had grown thorns. My garden, on the contrary, needed new flowers. Over time, my home became a refuge again, not a battlefield. I replaced the curtains with lighter ones and planted geraniums in the window. Each small change was a symbol that life was moving forward. I began writing in a notebook, recording everything. Not only the facts, but also the raw emotions I experienced. Words helped me organize the pain, but also see the victories. I discovered that writing is like sewing. Each sentence closes an invisible wound. Eddie began visiting me occasionally. Now working in a small community office, he would say, "You helped me find my way." I would respond that he had done the same for me. Sometimes two broken lives meet to mend each other. 6 months later, I was no longer the same Mildred who nearly signed her own arrest. I was different, stronger, more attentive, more whole. I was invited to speak at a seniors association about financial scams. In that simple auditorium, I told my story as I'm telling it now. I saw teary eyes. I saw hands clasped. I saw heavy silences become courage. I told everyone, never let small stumbles define who you are. You are the sum of the entire journey. I received a standing ovation, and in that sound I recognized the echo of Harold's laughter. He would have said, "See, Millie, you were always bigger than they imagined." I smiled, feeling I was exactly where I was supposed to be. From survivor, I became a guide. Looking back today, I know my victory wasn't just preserving the legacy Harold left behind. It was keeping alive the essence of what he most admired in me. My autonomy, my clarity, my dignity. Money may change. The memory of who we are cannot be falsified. Michael and I continue rebuilding our relationship, brick by brick, now without lies. Maisie became a closed chapter, and Eddie was given a new lease on life, and I, Mildred Whitmore, 64, discovered that I am not an incompetent old woman, but the protagonist of my own story. I transformed wounds into purpose, pain into tools, silence into voices, and every time I look at Harold's watch, I feel him telling me, "Mission accomplished." Tried to reduce me to a signature, but I responded with a manifesto. And in that manifesto, I wrote the word that defines my existence: freedom. That spring morning, I woke to the birds singing louder than usual. It was as if they were announcing that the winter of my life had finally passed. I got up early, made scrambled eggs and mint tea, and sat at the table without the rush of someone who owes explanations. The sun streamed in through the kitchen window, gilding every detail as if it were a painting painted just for me. I took out my notebook and wrote, "Today I begin a new chapter." It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a decision. I realized I was ready to turn the page, unafraid of what would come. Harold, in some dimension, smiled with me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't cry when I remembered him. I smiled, proud to have honored his legacy. I received a call from the Neighborhood Seniors Association. They wanted me to lead a support group for women victims of financial manipulation. At first I hesitated. I thought, who am I to guide anyone? But soon I remembered how my story had touched so many people in the auditorium. I accepted, my heart racing, like someone accepting an unexpected gift. The following week, the room was full. White-haired women with sad looks and tired hands. Each one brought their pain in invisible envelopes. I heard stories of sons who blackmailed, daughters-in-law who fabricated illnesses, lawyers who peddled illusions. Each story, I saw reflections of my own struggle, and I realized we were all connected by the same thread of resistance. In that group, I learned more than I taught. I realized that strength isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. A woman named Ruth told me how she nearly lost her family farm to a well-meaning son-in-law. Another, Dolores, spoke of how she signed papers without understanding and began living off favors. As they spoke, I held their hands, repeated, "You are not alone." It was powerful to see the sparkle return to their eyes. Some even laughed at the end, as if they had rediscovered forgotten pieces of themselves. The room, once heavy, filled with hope. It was like turning stones into seeds, and I felt Harold proudly pushing me forward. Once, after a group meeting, Ruth took me aside. "You saved my life, Mildred. If you hadn't come here, I would have given up." Those words sank deep. like a needle stitching together a torn soul, cupped her face with both hands and replied, "It wasn't me, Ruth. It was you who decided to believe again." She wept, and I wept with her. It was in that moment that I realized my purpose was clear. I was not only a survivor, but a guardian of other voices. My heart, once weary, now beat with renewed strength. I felt more alive than ever. It was as if I had been reborn, and this time with a mission. Gradually, the group gained momentum. Invitations came to speak at schools, churches, local and radio programs. My story was no longer just mine, it was a banner. I learned to speak in public, to hold the microphone firmly, and let my voice vibrate. At first, my hands trembled, but then I realized I didn't need perfection, just truth. And truth I had in abundance. Every time I said, I almost lost my autonomy over a signature, people held their breath. And when I finished with, but I got my voice back, applause erupted, warming the entire room. It was a cycle. I inhaled, and they gave me back energy. And so I continued to cultivate courage. Michael began attending some lectures in silence. I'd see him sitting in the back, discreet, as if he needed to relearn who his mother was. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to justify anything. He just listened. And little by little, I realized he too was changing. One day, after a lecture, he came up to me and said, "Mom, I'm proud of you." Those words were heavier than any testament because they didn't come from obligation, but from recognition. I held his hand and I felt we were rebuilding something priceless, trust. It was hard not to cry right there in front of everyone. But I took a deep breath, smiled, and simply said, "Thank you, son." At one of the group meetings, Sarah Chen appeared as a special guest. She spoke about how to identify fraud, the importance of questioning and reporting. The women listened to her with attentive eyes, as if each word were a key unlocking locked doors. At the end, Sarah looked at me and said, "If it weren't for you, perhaps many of these voices would still be silent." I felt my face heat up, half shy, half proud. I'd never seen myself as a hero, but in that moment, I realized I could be a beacon. The women clapped, and I was moved. It was proof that from the greatest wound can be born the greatest mission, and I was ready to carry it, not as a burden, but as a flag. Time passed, and I realized I hadn't just regained what was mine. I had gained something new, a sense of belonging, of community, of purpose. The pain of nearly being erased became the strength to prevent others from being silenced. I, Mildred Whitmore, 64, a widow, was no longer seen as a vulnerable elderly woman. I was seen as an example of resilience. My name even appeared in local newspapers, in articles about empowerment in old age. I received letters from strangers thanking me for sharing my story. Some even said, "You gave me the courage to say no." Each letter was a gift wrapped in hope, and I kept them all in a blue box like treasures. Still, there were difficult days, days when loneliness screamed, when the absence of Harold weighed like a stone on my chest. On those days, I allowed myself to cry. I learned that tears aren't weakness, but cleansing of the soul. After crying, I always did something for myself. A walk, a dessert, a call to a loved one. It was my way of remembering that life goes on. Harold's watch on my wrist never stopped, and I couldn't stop either. With each tick, it reminded me to keep going, and so even longing became fuel. Fuel for life. I began teaching writing classes to elderly women at the community center. The idea was simple. Each one record their own story before anyone else tried to rewrite it. The first few classes were timid, but soon the notebooks filled with memories. Stories of love, struggle, loss, and victory. It was moving to see these women discover that their voices had value. I would say, write as if you were speaking to your granddaughters. They need to know who you are. And with each class, I realized that we weren't just writing, we were resisting. Resisting oblivion, invisibility, and manipulation. It was our way of saying we are here and our story matters. And it mattered a lot. Today, looking back on everything I've experienced, I know my greatest achievement wasn't winning a court battle. It was reclaiming my identity. They tried to reduce me to numbers, to paperwork, to a forced signature. But I proved I am more than that. I am memory. I am decision. I am freedom. And when I think of Harold, I feel I've fulfilled the silent promise I made before his coffin, to never let anyone erase what we built. Now, when someone calls me an inspiration, I smile. Not because I consider myself a heroine, but because I know I survived to tell the tale. And to tell the tale is to live twice, and I want to live much more. On a quiet afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea. The wind ruffled the white curtains like the pages of an open book. I took out my notebook and began writing not about pain, but about gratitude. I listed simple things: the smell of baking bread, a neighbor's smile, the courage to say no. I realized my life wasn't limited to what they tried to steal from me. It was made of layers, like a well-filled cake. And I, who had almost been reduced to a signature, now felt like the author of an entire story. With each word written, my chest felt lighter. It was like flowers in a garden that had previously only been overgrown with weeds. And I decided I would never again let anyone prune my roots. I began receiving invitations for interviews on local radio stations. At first, the idea of speaking to so many people scared me. But I soon realized that my voice, previously silenced, now had an unexpected reach. I told my story simply, without embellishments, the way one friend might tell another. And I realized how the calls from emotional listeners, my struggle, echoed in many homes. One woman said, "Mildred, you spoke for me. I too almost signed papers without understanding." I cried listening to that because I saw proof that my suffering had become a tool. Radio stations opened doors, and with each interview, I felt more confident. I didn't need to memorize anything. I just had to speak truthfully. And truth was what I had in abundance. In one of these interviews, Eddie was also invited. He spoke of his downfall, how he lost his way, and how he found his dignity by helping to expose the fraud. I listened with admiration, knowing how hard it was to get back up after falling so low. At the end, the host asked, "What have you learned from all this?" I answered without much thought, that no one is too small to become a giant when they decide not to remain silent. Eddie nodded, his eyes welling up, and added, "And no one is too lost to be unable to start over." The studio was silent for a few seconds, applause followed by spontaneous. It was one of the most memorable moments of my life. I left feeling light, as if I had left a piece of my pain in the microphone, and kept only hope with me. Over time, I realized that my home had become a meeting place. Women came for coffee, to share experiences, to seek advice. The smell of orange cake permeated the air, and conversations filled the rooms with life. Loneliness, which had previously been a constant shadow, now dissipated in friendly voices. I laughed out loud, something I hadn't done in years. I discovered that happiness can be simple: a set table, occupied chairs, stories exchanged. No one talked about inheritances or trusts anymore. We talked about life, new beginnings, grandchildren, flowers, and each shared laugh was a victory over those who tried to silence me. My house was finally home. One day, Michael came accompanied by his daughter, my granddaughter Lily. She ran up to me with a drawing in her hands, 2 large hearts and a small one inside. "That's you, Daddy, and Grandpa Harold in heaven. she said with the innocence only a child possesses. My eyes filled with tears, but this time they were sweet. Michael smiled, and I realized that despite everything, there was still love between us. The three of us hugged together as if the drawing had come to life. That moment was worth more than any inheritance, because deep down, that's what matters: love and memory. And in that embrace, I felt Harold was also present. Somehow, and the family endured. Lily began visiting me often. She brought her light-hearted energy, her endless questions, and her childlike curiosity. She wanted to hear my old stories about when her father was little, about trips with Harold. I told her every detail, and she laughed out loud, her eyes shining. It was like reliving life through a new generation. And I realized that telling stories wasn't just about recording the past, it was about ensuring the future. Lily became a guardian of memories without even realizing it. And I grew stronger, realizing that nothing would be forgotten. It was a beautiful cycle. I taught, she learned, and together we preserved Harold. That was the greatest legacy. One night, before going to sleep, I opened the blue box where I kept the letters I'd received. I read one from a woman who said, "You gave me the courage to face my son." I wept silently, but with gratitude. I realized the impact of my struggle had reached far beyond my town. It was like a stone thrown into water, whose ripples spread far and wide. I closed the box and hugged the pillow tightly. My heart felt warm, as if Harold were lying beside me, not sadly, but serenely. I fell asleep with a smile, something I hadn't seen in a long time, and I dreamed I was flying lightly, without chains. The support group grew so much that we had to move to a larger space. Now, we were dozens of women, each with her own story of overcoming adversity. Some arrived with their heads down, but left standing tall, with sparkles in their eyes. Others brought friends, multiplying the support network. I looked at it and felt immense pride. It was living proof that, together, we are unbeatable. It wasn't just about me, it was about all of us, about no longer accepting being treated as invisible. It was about being seen, heard, respected. And this movement was just beginning. A local journalist wrote a story about the group. The headline read, "Widow turns scam into mission inspiring dozens of elderly women." When I saw the story, I cried with emotion. It was as if society finally recognized that our stories matter. Many women called me after the publication, some just to say thank you, others asking for help. My phone became a hotline of courage, and I answered each call patiently because I knew there was pain on the other end, but there was also hope, and I couldn't let it fade. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter from Maisie. She said she was sorry, acknowledging the manipulation and asking for forgiveness. I read each line carefully, unhurriedly. My heart wavered between anger, hurt, and compassion. I didn't respond right away. I put the letter in the blue box along with the others, because forgiveness isn't immediate, it's a process, and I didn't want to be unfair to my own feelings. But just her admitting it was a change. Maybe one day I'll respond, maybe not. But the cycle had already broken. Michael, for his part, continued his rebuilding. He found a stable job and began gradually paying off his debts. He often came to visit me, not out of obligation but out of affection. Our conversations, once filled with hurt, now had a lightness. We talked about music, old movies, Lily. Little by little, the wound between us healed. It still hurt, but it no longer bled. And I knew that, in time, our trust would be completely restored. It was a long road, but we were walking together, and that was already a victory. One day, asked Lily, "Grandma, are you afraid of being alone?" I smiled at her and replied, "No, my dear, because I've learned to be my own company." She frowned, not fully understanding, but hugged me tightly. In that embrace, I felt the answer was right. Loneliness no longer frightened me. I had a voice, a purpose, memories, and people around me. And even when I was alone, I would have myself. That was the greatest lesson, to be whole, even when they tried to break me. And I, Mildred Whitmore, was whole again. That summer, I was invited to speak at a statewide conference on elder rights. On stage, in front of hundreds of people, I felt my hands tremble like they had when I walked down the aisle to marry Harold. But as soon as I began to speak, fear turned to strength. I told my story in detail, from the parking lot to the blueberry room. The audience held their breath as if they were living every moment with me. And when I described the moment Eddie entered with the evidence, I heard murmurs of relief. At the end, I received a standing ovation. And in that sound, I heard not only their recognition, but also confirmation that my pain had not been in vain. I was now a public voice, and that gave me responsibility. A responsibility I embraced courageously. After the conference, a young lawyer came up to me. "Mrs. Whitmore, your story inspired me to work defending the elderly. I want to dedicate my career to this." My heart swelled with joy. It was like planting a tree and seeing it, already providing shade for another generation. I held her hands and said, "Never forget, every role has a life behind it. Always defend life." She nodded, moved, and hugged me sincerely. It was at that moment that I realized my fight had transcended age boundaries. I wasn't just inspiring women, but also young people who could change the future. I left the conference feeling light, certain that the chain was growing, and I was just the first link. Back home, I found Michael waiting on the porch. He brought simple flowers, daisies, Harold's favorites. "I wanted to welcome you like Daddy would," he said, and my heart sank. We sat together in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the night crickets. Not many words were necessary. Sometimes silence rebuilds more than long speeches. Afterward, he told me he'd been promoted at work. I felt pride, but also relief. He was finally forging his own path. And that night, I realized I hadn't lost my son. I just needed to rescue him. And I did. Over time, I began to be called Miss Mildred of the group. It was a simple title, but one that carried respect. The women saw me not as a victim, but as a role model, and I learned to carry that title with humility. I never wanted to be a heroine, but I accepted being an example, because I understood that example is a seed. You plant it without knowing where it will germinate, and every time someone said, "You gave me courage," I felt Harold smile. It was as if he were saying, "Keep going, Millie, you were born for this." And so, I moved forward, with my head held high. One day, Ruth, that lady from the group, brought me a box. Inside was a handkerchief embroidered with lilac flowers. "It's to remind you that your voice is color, not silence," she said. I held the handkerchief tenderly and couldn't hold back the tears. It was more than a gift. It was recognition. Ruth had reclaimed the farm, and now she was the one inspiring other women. I felt proud of her, as if she were my own daughter. The cycle was complete. I had helped her, and now she was helping others. The lilac handkerchief began to accompany me to lectures. It was my lucky charm. I also received an official letter. The case against Dalton and Pierce had ended. Both were convicted of falsehood and conspiracy. Reading that sentence was like hearing a judge say, "Mildred, you were right all along." I didn't celebrate with fireworks, just with silence. A silence of justice served, of a cycle closed. I kept the letter along with the other documents, but this time without pain. It was just a memory of a battle won. Maisie, for her part, was completing her community service hours. I learned she worked in a soup kitchen. Perhaps it was life's way of teaching her humility. During this time, Eddie visited me again. He looked different. Clean-shaven, clean clothes, a steady gaze. "I've got a steady job, Mildred. I'm starting over." I felt proud of him, as if he were part of my family. I offered him coffee and cake, and we talked for hours. He told me he dreamed of studying community law. I smiled and said, "You already understand more about justice than many lawyers." He laughed, a little shyly, but with a sparkle in his eyes. I realized he too had been reborn, and that, somehow, we had saved each other. One Saturday, Lily asked to sleep over. I made up her room with flowered sheets and told her stories until she fell asleep. Before she closed her eyes, she asked, "Grandma, have you ever been afraid of disappearing?" The question took me by surprise. I replied, "Yes, my dear, but I've learned that as long as we tell our story, we never disappear." She smiled and snuggled into the pillow. I watched her sleep, so peaceful. And I thought that perhaps this was my greatest mission, to ensure that our voices never disappear. Not mine, not hers, not any woman's. That was what drove me. On Harold's birthday, I took flowers to the cemetery. I sat beside the headstone and talked to him as I did at home. "Honey, I survived. They tried to silence me, but they couldn't." I told him every detail as if he needed to hear it. I spoke of Michael, of Lily, of the support group, of the lectures. I felt the wind gently blow on my face in response. It was as if Harold were there, silently making me proud. I left Michael's daisies next to the violets I'd brought, and I left with a light heart, because I knew he was at peace, and so was I. Once, during a lecture, I asked the audience, "Many of you here have ever been afraid of losing your voice?" Almost every hand went up. It was a powerful, almost painful moment, but also liberating, because everyone understood they were not alone. I then shared how I resisted, and how everyone there could resist too. Applause echoed through the room, not as a formality, but as a collective cry. It was as if my struggle had become theirs too. And that's when I realized, overcoming isn't just individual, it's shared. And sharing healed me, it healed them. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Overcoming is transforming pain into a bridge, not a prison." These words echoed in my head. Every time someone thanked me, I felt a brick in that bridge was finished, and that, in the end, we would all cross together. I looked at the bookshelf with the family portraits. I saw Harold smiling. I saw Michael as a child. I saw Lily running in the backyard. All of this was my life, whole, complex, beautiful. And I realized that no one could ever reduce me to incompetent, because incompetent is the one who tries to steal the voice of others. I, on the contrary, learned to multiply it. Today, as I write these lines, I feel a peace I never imagined I would feel. I've passed through the valley of distrust, betrayal, and the near loss of autonomy. And I've come out the other side stronger, more aware and freer. My home is full of life, my family is rebuilding, and my heart is at peace. I still miss Harold, of course, but now that loss doesn't paralyze me, it drives me. I am Mildred Whitmore, and my story didn't end that day in the parking lot. It began there, and it continues to this day, alive in every word I share. And as long as there are people listening, I will never disappear. One day, as I opened my mail, I found an unexpected invitation. It was from a local university, asking me to speak to law students. At first, I thought it was funny. Me, a 64-year-old widow, speaking to young academics. But soon I realized it made sense. My story was a living case study in ethics, fraud, and resilience. I accepted with a certain butterflies in my stomach, remembering Harold always saying, "Millie, you speak better than you think." In that modern auditorium, full of screens and computers, I told my story, not as a lecture, but as a testimony. And I saw something in their eyes that surprised me. Respect, genuine respect for an ordinary woman who refused to be silenced. After the lecture, a student asked me, "Mrs. Whitmore, what gave you the strength not to sign?" I smiled and replied, "Harold's love and the knowledge that I was no less than I always was." She wrote down my words as if they were law. And in that moment, I realized that we don't need to be lawyers to teach justice. We can simply be human with courage and memory. The class teacher thanked me, saying, "You taught more in 1 hour than many books." I left feeling emotional, almost floating. It was as if I had accomplished a silent mission. And I realized that each time I shared, I healed a little more of myself. The healing was in the telling. As the months passed, my routine transformed. I stopped being just the widow who almost lost everything. I became a reference, a guest, a listener. But I never stopped being Mildred, the woman who likes strong tea and orange cake. This balance was essential to not lose myself in the midst of the struggle. I didn't want to be just a symbol. I wanted to remain a person, and being a person meant tending the garden, calling friends, laughing at silly things on television. It was in this simple daily life that I found fuel for the bigger battles. Without it, the fight would lose color, and I never wanted to live in black and white. One day, Eddie brought me some news. He'd gotten a scholarship to study at night. His eyes sparkled like a child given a new bike. "I'm going to law school, Mildred. I want to help people like you." My eyes filled with tears and I hugged him tightly. It was incredible to see how far he'd come since that day in the parking lot. From a lost man, he'd become someone with purpose, and I knew Harold would have been proud of him too. Life has these ironies. The one who entered as a disintegrated ex-paralegal became my greatest ally, and together we showed that new beginnings are possible, always. With Lily, every day was a new discovery. She loved playing storybooks with me. We'd sit together, me with my notebook, she with colored paper. We'd write about princesses, superheroes, and brave women. One day, she wrote, "My grandma is my hero." I read it aloud and couldn't hold back the tears. It was the greatest recognition I could ever receive. More than newspapers, conferences, or applause, it was the pure gaze of a child that validated me. Harold would have laughed and said, "You've always been her hero." And I finally believed it. The following spring, I organized a larger gathering, bringing together women from different silver-haired women came, some with canes, others with firm smiles. Each brought a story, and the room became a mosaic of voices. We spoke of deception, but also of dreams of traveling, of painting, of going back to school. I realized that when we have a voice, we also regain our desires, and that moved me deeply. We weren't just victims of manipulation, we were living, fulfilled women, full of futures, and the future would not be denied us, not anymore. At that meeting, I met 76, who had been deceived by her own son. She told her story with tears, but also with impressive strength. At the end, she hugged me and said, "You showed me that there's still time to start over." Those words stayed with me, because I realized that my story was no exception. It was part of a silent movement, a movement of women standing up against centuries of silencing. And I was part of it, not by initial choice, but by destiny. And I accepted this mission with gratitude. Gratitude. A national journalist reported on our movement. Suddenly, my story spread from my neighborhood to the entire country. The messages multiplied, coming from places I never imagined I'd reach. Some women said they'd watched in secret, afraid their families would find out. Others said they felt represented for the first time. I read each message with tears in my eyes. It was proof that our struggle had broken down walls, and that the truth, even when tempted to be silenced, always finds a way, always. And that gave me more strength. Michael, upon seeing the report, called me, overcome with emotion. "Mom, I wanted to apologize again. Now I see the magnitude of what almost happened." His voice was filled with regret, but also with sincerity. I calmly replied, "The most important thing is that you've learned and changed, son." He cried on the other end of the line, and I cried with him. Our tears met through the phone cord, and I felt that, finally, the bridge between us, not perfect, but solid enough for us to cross together. Harold from somewhere was smiling. I was sure of it. That same day, Lily video called me. "Grandma, I saw you on TV. You looked like a queen." I laughed out loud and replied, "Not a queen, my dear, just a grandmother who wouldn't be silenced." She smiled and said, "For me, yes, she is a queen." Her innocence was fuel for my soul, because it reminded me that everything I did wasn't just for myself, but for future generations. I wanted her to grow up knowing that women have a voice, and that no one can steal that from her, ever. That was my legacy. At home, I began to see each object with a new meaning. Harold's watch, the violet brooch, the letters in the blue box. Everything was a symbol of resistance, not just a memory. Even the signs of wear on the kitchen table became signs of life. I finally understood that nothing about me was a flaw. Everything was history, and history deserves to be respected. The mirror, when I no longer saw the woman who had almost been annulled. I saw a warrior who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger, and that gave me peace, so much peace. Today, as I write these lines, I know my journey continues, but I'm no longer afraid. I know obstacles will come, but I also know I have the voice and strength to face them. My life isn't perfect, but it is authentic, and that's enough. I'm Mildred Whitmore, 64, widow, survivor, and now a guide for other women. My overcoming was not just personal, but collective. And every time I tell this story, I feel like I'm fulfilling my role, not as a victim, but as a protagonist. And a protagonist is the one who writes their own ending. The following fall, I organized a larger event at the community center. We invited honest lawyers, psychologists, and even police representatives. The hall was packed with curious women, men, and young people. I took the stage with my lilac scarf draped over my shoulder, a symbol of our resilience. I told my story again, but this time I noticed something different. There was no longer pain in every word. There was strength. People listened to me as if they were facing living proof that it is possible to overcome. When I finished, a white-haired woman stood up and said, "Mildred, you've given me back my courage." Applause echoed through the room, and my heart pounded, not with fear, but with gratitude. It was as if Harold were there, sitting in the front row, smiling at me. And I smiled back, albeit silently. After the event, I sat alone on the garden bench. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and freedom. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling every cell in my body vibrate with life. I remembered how it all began: a parking lot, an unexpected notice, a manila envelope, and I thought, if I had ignored Eddie, where would I be now? Perhaps trapped in an unfair trust, perhaps erased as a person. But no, I chose to resist, and that choice not only my fate, but that of many others. It was a moment of clarity so powerful that I even cried. I cried with pride. Michael began to participate more actively in the group meetings. He listened silently, absorbing each story as a lesson. The women looked at him suspiciously at first, but soon realized his sincerity. One day, he stood up and said, "I wronged my mother, but I learned from her. Today I want to be an ally, not an accomplice to abuse." The room fell silent, applause followed by a timid I moved, felt I was seeing not only my son, but a man being reborn. Life had given him a second chance and he was making the most of it. Harold would have been proud, and I was proud too, very proud. It was a true new beginning. Maisie, on the other hand, remained distant. She completed her community service hours but never attempted contact beyond that letter. Sometimes I wondered if I should forgive her, but I realized that forgiveness can't be forced. It comes when the heart is ready, and mine wasn't yet. But she also didn't harbor hatred. It was simply indifference, and that was liberation in itself, because indifference is when the wound no longer hurts, and I preferred to spend my energy on those who cared about me. Maisie became just a closed chapter, nothing more. The group grew so much that we created a small association. We called it Free Voices. The title came from a conversation where someone said, "Our voice is our greatest asset." We held monthly meetings, lectures, and workshops. At each meeting, new women showed up, each with their own story, and they all left stronger than when they arrived. It was like a healing circle. I felt blessed to have been part of this movement. It was like watching a seed become a forest, and that forest could no longer be cut down. A national newspaper ran another story, this time about Vos livres. This time it wasn't just my story, but all of ours. Seeing our faces in the paper was moving. Even received messages from other countries. We discovered that similar scams were happening everywhere. Our struggle, after all, was universal. I read the messages with tears in my eyes, and I understood that we were connected by an invisible thread of courage, a thread that no one could cut, ever. Around this time, I began writing a book, not a novel, but an honest account of my journey. Each page was like a mirror of my experience. I wrote at night, with the ticking of Harold's clock accompanying me. Lily would sometimes sit beside me, drawing while I wrote. She would say, "Grandma, I want everyone to read your story." I would smile and reply, "That's what I'm trying to do, my dear." The book became a life project, a way to record my voice forever, and to ensure it would never be erased. During this process, I discovered the power of the written word. It not only records, but also liberates. Each sentence I wrote was like releasing a stone I'd carried for years, and little by little, my chest felt lighter. I wasn't writing just for myself, but for all those who hadn't had the chance to speak. It was as if I were lending my voice to those who were still silent, and that gave me meaning, more meaning than any material possession. It was my legacy in the making, and I knew Harold beamed with pride. One day, as I was leaving the supermarket, I was stopped by a strange woman. "You're Mildred, aren't you? I wanted to thank you. Thanks to you, I didn't let my nephew touch my pension." I was speechless. I just hugged her. I realized my story already had a life of its own, traveling without me. It touched people I would never meet, and that was wonderful. It was like planting a tree and seeing fruit in faraway places. My heart filled with joy, and I understood once again that it was all worth it. Every tear, every struggle. Over time, my talks became more natural. I no longer trembled, no longer afraid of the microphone. I spoke as if I were in my living room, having tea with friends, and perhaps that was what touched people so much. The simplicity, because I wasn't an actress, nor a politician. I was just an ordinary woman who didn't give up, and that authenticity won hearts. I always received more than I gave. More hugs, more smiles, more stories. And that was priceless. Lily, increasingly curious, said she wanted to be a lawyer. "I want to defend people like you, Grandma." My heart swelled with pride. Maybe she'd change her mind in the future. But just dreaming about it, moved me. She was living proof that my struggle wasn't in vain, because inspiring the future is greater than winning in the present. I held her small hands and said, "Whatever it is, never let anyone silence your voice." She smiled as if she understood more than she let on, and she hugged me tightly. It was all I needed. Today, when I walk through the park, I feel the wind on my face and I remember Harold, but not as a painful absence, as a gentle presence. He lives in every step I take, in every victory I achieve. My life is not perfect, but it is full, and I have learned to celebrate that. I am Mildred Whitmore, and my story is not about losing, but about recovering. I have regained my voice, my dignity, my strength, and I have turned all of this into a mission. As long as I live, I will tell this story, and even after, it will live on. One rainy morning, I woke up wanting to revisit the courthouse where it all began. I grabbed my blue umbrella and headed there. The building, imposing as always, seemed less daunting now. I walked through the cold corridors, remembering the day I nearly lost my life to false paperwork. I felt a chill, but also an immense sense of pride. I was no longer a victim, I was a survivor. I slipped quietly into the empty Blueberry courtroom. I ran my hand over the table, remembering the blinking red recorder. I smiled, because right where they tried to silence me, my voice was reborn. Whispered, "Thank you, Harold. Thank you. Me." As I left the building, I met Eddie outside as if fate had arranged for us to meet. He carried a briefcase and beamed from ear to ear. "Mildred, I passed the first semester. I got good grades." I hugged him like one would hug a child. It was moving to see his transformation. He thanked me again, but I replied, "Don't thank me. You just remembered who you always were." We laughed together with the lightheartedness of those who have overcome different but equally difficult battles. We promised to celebrate his graduation one day, and I knew that day would come because Eddie now walked with purpose. I returned home with a warm heart. I made vegetable soup and lit a candle on the sideboard. The soft light illuminated Harold's photo, and I gazed at it in silence. You would have liked Eddie, love. He has flaws, but he also has courage. That was how I talked to him, as if he was still there. The longing didn't hurt like before. It was companionship. As I ate the soup, I realized that my life, despite its scars, was beautiful. Beautiful because it was authentic, and because I had learned to transform pain into hope. That was my true miracle. At the Vos et Livres Association, we decided to create a simple booklet to guide the elderly. Using accessible language, we explained how to identify fraud, scams, and manipulation. I wrote the introduction myself. This booklet is the fruit of tears that turned into struggle. May it protect your voice. We distributed it in churches, markets, and health centers. The response was incredible. Many people stopped me on the street to thank me. It was as if each printed page was a piece of my story spread throughout the world. And I felt fulfilled. It was further proof that nothing was in vain, that even pain can educate. Lily loved helping distribute the booklets. She ran between the chairs, handing out pamphlets with the most charming smile I'd ever seen. "My grandma wrote this," she'd say proudly to everyone. People laughed and praised her, and I swelled with pride too. It was beautiful to see how my struggle became a lesson for her. I knew that, in the future, Lily would carry that flame. No matter what profession she chose, she already had within her the seed of courage, and I was witness to it. It was like seeing life renewing itself before my eyes, and that gave me peace. One night, Michael invited me to dinner at his house. It was the first time I'd accepted, after everything. I prepared myself carefully, wearing a blue dress and pinning my hair up. When I arrived, I found a simple but lovingly set table. Michael was nervous but also determined. "Mom, I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me," he said right away. I held his hand and replied, "You never abandon a child, but they have to learn on their own." He nodded, his eyes welling up. The dinner was light, full of laughter and fond memories, and I realized our relationship had truly been. After that dinner, Michael began visiting me more often. He brought little things, flowers, fruit, even books. Each gesture was like a brick in rebuilding our trust. I could tell he was different, more mature, more present. It was a rebirth not only for him, but for me as well. Because being a mother, after all, is learning to forgive without forgetting. And in that process, I also healed. With each hug, I felt the bridge between us strengthen, and that we were finally on the same side of the river, the side of love. In the winter, the Voses Livres group organized a community fair. There were crafts, traditional foods, and short lectures. The room was filled with colors and scents, and the atmosphere was celebratory. I looked around and saw women who had previously been downcast, now smiling, selling their work, telling their stories. It was like watching a garden bloom. I was moved several times that day, and I thought, this is why I resisted for this moment. It was the embodiment of our collective strength, and proof that, when united, we were invincible, absolutely invincible. I was invited to speak on a television show. It was something I never imagined. I entered the studio nervous, but soon calmed down when I remembered everything I'd faced. I told my story calmly, without theatrics, and at the end, the host said, "You are an inspiration to the entire country." The cameras captured my shy but genuine smile, and in that moment, I realized my voice had reached places I never thought it would. I returned home exhausted but happy, because I knew Harold would have been proud too, very proud. After the program, my mailbox filled with letters. Some came from far away, even from other states. They were stories from people who had also resisted, who had also fought. I read each one carefully, putting it in the blue box. It was as if my heart was expanding with each story. I no longer carried just my own pain, but that of many others. And I transformed it all into hope. It was a light burden because it was shared, and sharing always brings relief, always. One afternoon, I decided to reread my notebook from the beginning. Each page brought back powerful memories, fears, tears, victories. I relived it all again, but with a different perspective. It was no longer pain, it was learning. I smiled when I realized how far I had come, how much I had grown. I closed the notebook lovingly and put it away on the shelf. It wasn't just a record, it was a testament to my strength, and I knew that one day Lily would read every page and be proud. Today, when I walk down the street and someone recognizes me, I don't feel vanity. I feel responsibility. A responsibility to keep speaking, to keep inspiring. My life didn't end with Harold nor with the attempted fraud. My life began again there, and each day is proof of that. I am Mildred Whitmore, and my story is one of pain, yes, but also of victory, of overcoming, of love, of memory. And I continue writing each chapter with courage, because that is the greatest legacy I can leave. In early spring, I organized a special meeting of the Free Voices group. I wanted to celebrate not only our victories but our unity. The hall was decorated with lilac flowers, the color of my scarf. There was cake, soft music, and above all, laughter. I looked at each face and saw stories that had once been pain, now become inspiration. Ruth, Dolores, so many others, all shining. Immense pride I felt in, almost too much to contain. I thought, Harold, look what we've accomplished. And in that moment, I realized that life had given me back so much more than anyone had tried to steal. It had given me purpose. At the end of the meeting, Lily stepped onto the makeshift stage. In her spontaneous way, she said, "My grandma is my hero, and so are all of you." The entire room applauded, and I couldn't hold back the tears. It was as if that moment summed up my entire journey. I didn't just fight for myself. I fought for her, for the future. That bright-eyed child was living proof that our voices would span generations. I hugged her tightly, feeling the energy of hope. The women around me smiled, some cried. It was a silent chorus of victory, and I'd never felt so whole. A few days later, I received the first printed copy of my revised booklet at home. I held the little book in my hands like a trophy. It was simple, yet powerful. There, my pain was condensed, transformed into wisdom. We distributed more copies, and each elderly person who received one looked at me with gratitude. It was as if to say, "You protected me without knowing me." And I silently responded, "We're in this together." The power of words is immense, I discovered. They penetrate walls, distances, fears, and they never fade. Michael, increasingly present, helped me with the distributions. He carried boxes, talked to the elderly, smiled. I saw in him a different man, rebuilt, and I felt that once wounded was now stronger than ever. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he always said. And I responded, "I'm proud of you too, son." It was a cycle of healing, of reparation, a cycle that Harold, wherever he was, certainly celebrated. After all, there was no greater victory than this reconciliation. It was love remade. Eddie, already in his second semester, brought me his grades, all above average. He smiled as if he had rediscovered his identity. "You believed in me when I no longer believed in myself." I held his hand and said, "Because I saw in you what they tried to erase from me, value." He cried, and so did I. Life had brought us together by chance, but now we were family at heart, an unlikely but strong bond. And I knew I would still hear many things about him, with pride. That summer, I received an invitation to be honored by the city government, an award for contribution to the community. I walked onto the stage with my lilac scarf and my heart pounding. As I received the plaque, I thought about everything I'd experienced, from the cold parking lot to that packed auditorium. Applause echoed, and I was deeply moved. It wasn't vanity, it was recognition. Recognition that my voice had made a difference. I looked at the audience and said, "Never let anyone try to steal who you are." That was my way of summing it all up, and everyone gave a standing ovation. At night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought of Harold. "Love, you guided me here." The memory of him was no longer a wound but light. I felt a deep peace, as if I could finally rest within myself. The clock on the nightstand ticked away slowly, unhurriedly. I was no longer afraid of time, because I knew I was truly living. I closed my eyes with a smile, and I fell asleep peacefully, a rare thing after so many turbulent years. It was a light sleep, with a soul at peace. The following months were filled with small joys: walks in the park, dinners with Michael, drawings from Lily, visits from Eddie. My life, once marked by pain, was now marked by gratitude. Every detail seemed more beautiful. The smell of bread, a child's laughter, even the sound of rain. I learned to cherish every moment. After all, everything could have been taken from me. But I fought, resisted, and prevailed. And now each day was a gift I opened slowly, with love. In the Voces Livres group, we continued to grow. We were no longer just women, but also young women eager to learn, filled with energy, and each meeting was a celebration of courage. I loved seeing their eyes shining, their hands raised, their voices firm. It was like watching a choir of hope. And I knew that, no matter how long I had left to live, my legacy was already there. planted, watered, and flourishing. A legacy that no one could erase, ever. It was eternal. Lily once asked me, "Grandma, do you have a dream you haven't fulfilled?" I thought for a moment and replied, "Yes, I want to travel to the sea and dip my toes in the sand." Her eyes lit up. "Then let's go together." I smiled, thrilled. It was a simple dream but full of meaning, because the sea, for me, has always symbolized freedom, and I wanted to feel it now more than ever. I promised her we would do it soon, and just imagining it made my heart happy. So much so. Today, looking back, I see a timeline full of falls and rises. I see the pain of nearly losing everything, but also the strength to recover. I see betrayal, but also reconciliation. I see silence, but also cries of victory. My life is not perfect, but it is true, and that is enough for me. I am Mildred Whitmore, 64 years old, and I chose not to be silenced. My story is my weapon, my flag, my light, and as long as I live, I will continue to tell it, because to tell is to resist. To conclude this story, I leave you with one final reminder. Never underestimate the strength of a woman who loved, lost, and decided to rise again. They tried to reduce me to numbers and paperwork, but I became a voice. They tried to paint me as incapable, but I became an example. Today, I don't carry resentment. I carry purpose. I'm not just Harold's widow. I'm the guardian of our memory. I'm the mother who forgave, the grandmother who inspired, the friend who listened, and above all, I'm the master of my life. The true testament isn't in the papers, but in what we built with love and courage, and that no one can ever falsify.